Hey guys, this is Justin. Hello and welcome to another video. Thank you for joining me. So, last week I talked common Star Wars misconceptions and also questions the films don't outright answer, including the gravitational orientation of the Death Star. I encouraged you all to leave some of your questions down below, and we're going to tackle one of them today. So, this user asks, a personal misconception I have is, what is the range of the Death Star? Why does it need a hop out of hyperspace, point blank range to fire? Also mentioning Starkiller base, and I thought this would be an interesting opportunity to talk about the Death Star's range, but also the various other super weapons in the galaxy which have either a significantly higher or lower range. And in terms of lower, we all think the Death Star was right next to Yavin, and I mean, compared to Starkiller base, sure, but the Death Star's range isn't that bad. It's clearly effective pretty close up, as we see at Scarif or at Jeddah, but we see during the Alderaan destruction that the Death Star, when there's not a gas giant in the way, can hit a target with enough destructive potential from pretty far away. I'm not going to try to guess exactly how far away the Death Star is here, but it certainly looks, the distance from the moon to Earth, hundreds of thousands of kilometers we're talking. When it comes to Yavin, I mean, my guess is simply that based on where the Death Star was located immediately before the battle, it was quicker for the Empire to jump out of hyperspace on that side of the gas giant and wait for the moon to come into position. Remember, they did not genuinely think there was a vulnerability. Otherwise, they could have perhaps done a jump which would have taken more time overall, but would have left the Death Star in system for less time. So yeah, I think that's kind of the rationale there. The main factor in the Death Star's range, especially compared to something like Starkiller base, would have simply been energy. In Star Wars, energy weapons have a relatively low range. It seems like they radiate heat and light pretty substantially, causing a drop-off, so that's why the Death Star has got to be right there. That's also, I think, why it didn't shoot through the Yavin gas giant. The Death Star is powerful, but the Death Star 1 especially was not without its limitations. Also, on a quick note, why Yavin and not Mon Calamari? Well, the Empire wanted to destroy Rebel High Command. I will also say Mon Calamari Rebellion, at least in Legends, turned up after the destruction of the first Death Star, at which point they also began militarizing their own systems. Mon Calamari was the first planet, or one of the first planets alongside the likes of Chandrila, the Empire planned to use the second Death Star on, but if you destroy Yavin, you cut the head off the Rebel Alliance, you kill a ton of their leaders, military personnel, everything. That makes it really hard for them to bounce back, to reorganize. If you destroy Mon Calamari, yes, you remove one of the Alliance's supporters, but you also create a cause other planets and people will flock behind. And that's something they probably should have recognized with Alderaan. But we're getting a little off topic. I want to go back to range. So the Death Star, I think we've kind of explained why there are limitations. What sort of super weapons had a lesser range than the Death Star? Well, it often comes down to the method of which they use to destroy the planet, which isn't surprising, but it's not like you usually see, energy-based weapons with a range lower than the Death Star. It just so happens to be that many of the, closer range super weapons just have different formats. For example, the World Devastators had to physically touch, or at least be proximate to the things they were destroying, because they essentially sucked up the planet, enemy starships, whatever, to produce new troops or material. Something like the Orbital Night Cloak obviously also had to be around the planet because it worked by blocking a planet off from its sun or its star. There were also various powerful bombs or ordnance which had to be dropped directly on a planet, but let's move up in range a little bit. So with the Death Star, I imagine you obviously have to be within the solar system. You probably have to be on a stellar scale, relatively close to the planet. If we move out a bit, we have something like the Sun Crusher. And we actually see, when it comes to longer range, often that the delivery vehicle is something with a bit more permeance than a laser. The Sun Crusher in particular uses what's known as a resonance torpedo to cause a system's star to go supernova. So the Sun Crusher itself isn't blowing a planet up, rather it's causing the sun or the star to go supernova, as we saw with the Kurita system. And it seems like you can relatively accurately fire the Sun Crusher in system and hit the primary. But we also have examples of even longer range weapons, and I want to talk about two from Star Wars Legends before moving on to Starkiller Base. First of all, if you've been watching my Legacy of the Force videos, you're probably expecting this one. We have Centerpoint Station. Centerpoint was a creation of the Celestials. It was one of several megastructures they left through the galaxy, most of which had some sort of gravity manipulating function. Centerpoint Station specifically could be used to move planets into position, and it's believed that Centerpoint Station, alongside the various repulsors placed on the worlds of Corellia, helped form that system, which had more inhabited planets than would otherwise be expected. Centerpoint Station, you can imagine a giant hand which could move across the galaxy, manipulating planets, but it had other powers. It could create interdiction fields across entire systems, and most notably for this video, the gravity beam could be used destructively as well to destroy either planets, as we saw during the Corellian Crisis, or entire fleets, as we saw at the Battle of Fondor. It arguably is the most powerful single superweapon in Star Wars Legends, at least if you ignore some of the pre-Old Republic / Old Republic stuff. We'll come back to that when I do a video on the destruction of the Second Fleet, but Centerpoint could hit targets across the galaxy. Again, an entire Vong and Hapan Armada was basically wiped out at Fondor when the station was in its usual place in the Corellian system. Another example of a very long-range, powerful weapon is the Galaxy Gun. This was one of Palpatine's super weapons when he came back in the Dark Empire series. The Galaxy Gun is honestly pretty simple. It's itself not physically impressive. It's like a long weapon that usually stays far, far away from anywhere it could be detected or attacked. In case of Dark Empire, it's at Biss. It essentially fired extremely powerful missiles which traveled themselves through hyperspace, which were powerful enough to destroy entire planets, but we also see targeting starships. So in that case, the range comes from the hyperspace capabilities of the missiles themselves, which is kind of unique and something I would like to see more in Star Wars. Now, let's talk about Starkiller Base, which honestly is probably closest to Centerpoint Station, even given the fact that it's powered by a star. That's true of Centerpoint, which had a miniaturized sun within its body. Starkiller Base siphons power from nearby stars to power its central weapon. Starkiller Base is also mobile. This isn't something we see in Episode 7, but it can move to siphon power from other stars. How the laser works and how you can see it move across the galaxy, I don't know, but that's the explanation. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. This was Super Weapons 101, so I apologize for it being a bit all over the place. I did have a lot of content to cover. I'll see you guys next time, though, and may the Force be with you.